A silent struggle. The final bell echoed through the school halls, signaling the beginning of Malik Andrews' last class of the day, History with Mrs. Langston. Malik took a deep breath, gripping the strap of his worn-out backpack as he made his way down the crowded corridor. History had always been one of his favorite subjects, a window into the stories of people who had fought, struggled, and triumphed. But with Mrs. Langston, his passion for history was slowly being crushed, buried under the weight of low grades and sharp criticisms. As he walked into the classroom, Malik instinctively moved to his usual seat at the back, where he had been relegated since the start of the semester. The other students laughed and chatted as they settled into their seats, seemingly oblivious to the tension Malik felt creeping up his spine. He noticed Mrs. Langston standing by her desk, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line as she observed the room. She was an older woman, her graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. To her, the classroom was her domain, a place where her authority went unquestioned. The first time Malik had walked into Mrs. Langston's class, he'd felt a strange sense of unease. It wasn't something he could put his finger on, just a subtle feeling, like a cloud hanging over him. Over time, that feeling had solidified into something darker. Mrs. Langston seemed to have a certain tone, a certain look she reserved just for him. When he spoke up in class, her replies were clipped, almost dismissive. When he turned in assignments, they came back with grades far lower than he felt he deserved. And he noticed that his classmates, many of whom barely skimmed the material, were praised for what seemed to him like half-hearted efforts. He wanted to believe it was all in his head, but each low grade, each dismissive glance, made it harder to hold on to that hope. Today was no different. Mrs. Langston had their graded reports in hand, and Malik's heart began to pound as he watched her scan the room with that familiar air of authority. "All right, everyone," she began, her voice sharp and unwavering. "I've graded your reports on influential figures in the civil rights movement. Some of you have shown an excellent grasp of the material, and I'm pleased with your efforts. Madison, Liam, Chloe, well done. Your reports were insightful." Malik's stomach churned as he waited. He'd spent hours on his report, researching not just the key figures, but trying to understand the essence of their struggle, their sacrifices. He'd stayed up late, cross-referencing sources, reading old speeches, immersing himself in the stories of people like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and John Lewis. This report was supposed to be his way of honoring their legacies, of showing Mrs. Langston and himself that he could rise above her low expectations. But when Mrs. Langston called his name, there was no warmth, no hint of praise. "Malik, come up and get your report," she said, her tone flat, almost challenging. He felt every eye in the room turn toward him as he stood, walking to the front of the class with his head held high despite the anxiety twisting his insides. She handed him the paper without looking at him, her face expressionless. Malik took it, glancing down at the grade scrawled in red at the top of the page. A C. His heart sank. Beneath the grade, Mrs. Langston had written in her precise, angular handwriting, "Lacks depth and clarity. Needs improvement." A C. He had poured everything into this assignment, gone above and beyond what was required, and yet she had reduced his effort to a mere C. Malik's throat tightened, and he clenched his jaw, determined not to let her see how much this hurt. "Is there a problem, Malik?" Mrs. Langston's voice broke through his thoughts, calm but laced with an edge that felt almost mocking. She arched an eyebrow, her gaze steady, daring him to question her judgment. He swallowed, forcing himself to meet her eyes. I just thought I did well," he managed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I put in a lot of time on this report." Mrs. Langston's expression remained unmoved. "Effort is one thing, Malik, but quality is another. Just because you try doesn't mean it was good enough." Her words were clipped as if she were speaking to a child who couldn't understand simple instructions. Malik felt his cheeks burn, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration welling up inside him. He had seen Liam, one of the students she had praised, working on his report in the library. Liam had spent half the time whispering jokes to his friends, barely glancing at his notes. Yet somehow, in Mrs. Langston's eyes, his work was more valuable, more deserving. Without another word, Malik returned to his seat, clutching the paper tightly. His classmates shot him sympathetic glances, but he ignored them, staring at the red ink on his report as Mrs. Langston resumed her lecture. Her voice droned on about the importance of understanding history, of learning from the past, but to Malik, her words felt hollow. How could she talk about justice and equality when she seemed to believe he was somehow less deserving, less capable? The class passed in a blur, and when the bell finally rang, Malik shoved the report into his backpack, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. As he slung his bag over his shoulder, Mrs. Langston called out to him once more. "Malik," she said, her voice softer but still firm. "If you're struggling with the material, I recommend you stay after school for extra help. There's no shame in asking for assistance." The implication was clear. She didn't believe he was capable of understanding the material on his own. She looked at him as if he were some puzzle she couldn't quite solve, a student who didn't fit into her neatly ordered world. He forced himself to nod, muttering a quiet, "Okay," before hurrying out of the classroom. The last thing he wanted was more time under her scrutinizing gaze, but he knew he couldn't ignore this forever. Something had to change. As Malik walked through the school hallway, he felt the weight of his frustration pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to make someone, anyone, understand how unfair it all felt. He had done everything he was supposed to, had worked harder than many of his classmates, and yet, in Mrs. Langston's eyes, it was never enough. He headed outside and slouched against the wall, waiting for his friend Caleb to finish basketball practice. His fingers drummed restlessly on his backpack, his mind replaying the interaction with Mrs. Langston over and over, each replay stoking the fire of resentment simmering within him. A few minutes later, Caleb jogged over, his hair damp with sweat, a grin on his face. "Hey, Malik, what's up? You look like someone stole your lunch money or something." Malik forced a half-hearted smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Feels like it. Mrs. Langston gave me another low grade on my report." Caleb frowned, his expression shifting from playful to concerned. "Again, dude, you worked so hard on that thing." "What did she say?" "She said it lacked depth and clarity," Malik replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "I don't get it, Caleb. I spent hours on it. I thought I did everything right." Caleb's frown deepened, and he shook his head. "Sounds to me like she's got it out for you. I've seen how she looks at you in class. It's like nothing you do is ever good enough for her." Malik sighed, kicking a small rock near his foot. "That's what it feels like. And then she tells me to stay after school for extra help, like I'm some kind of lost cause." Caleb placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, his expression sympathetic. "Man, you should tell your mom about this. She'd definitely have your back." Malik hesitated. The idea of telling his mom had crossed his mind, but he didn't want to worry her. She was already juggling long hours at work, trying to make ends meet, and he didn't want to add to her stress. "Maybe," he replied quietly. "But I don't know. I don't want to make a big deal out of it. What if it just makes things worse?" Caleb nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Malik's decision. "I get it, man. But you can't let her keep treating you like this. You deserve better." Malik forced a small smile, grateful for his friend's support. As they walked home together, Caleb tried to distract him with talk of their favorite video game, and Malik did his best to engage. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of being singled out, of being made to feel like he was somehow less than his classmates. Later that evening, as he sat at the kitchen table pretending to do his homework, his mother, Latoya, glanced over at him from the stove. She noticed the tension in his face, the way his shoulders slumped, and her heart ached for her son. "Malik," she said gently, stirring the pot on the stove, "you've been awfully quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" Malik hesitated, tapping his pencil against his notebook. He wanted to tell her, to let her know how unfair it felt, how Mrs. Langston's words made him feel like he wasn't good enough. But the thought of burdening her held him back. "It's nothing, Mom," he replied softly. "Just tired, I guess." She tilted her head, studying him with a mother's intuition. "You sure? You know you can tell me anything, right?" He nodded, managing a small smile. "I know. Thanks, Mom." But as he returned to his homework, the feeling of being singled out, of being seen through a lens he couldn't fully understand, remained. And deep down, Malik knew that he couldn't keep ignoring this. He couldn't keep his head down forever. Something had to change. He just didn't know how to make that happen yet. A glimpse of injustice. The next day, Malik walked into Mrs. Langston's class with a feeling of unease settling in his stomach. After his talk with Caleb, he had stayed up late, thinking over his options. He knew he couldn't keep letting Mrs. Langston treat him this way, but he was also wary of causing a scene or drawing even more negative attention. He resolved to simply keep his head down, work as hard as he could, and prove his worth through his actions. As he slid into his usual seat at the back of the room, he noticed his classmates buzzing with excitement. It was the day of their group presentations, where each student was to present a historical figure and their contribution to the civil rights movement. Malik had been assigned Rosa Parks, a figure he deeply admired. He'd spent hours researching her courage, her quiet defiance, and the ripple effect her actions had on the movement. He was determined to give the best presentation he could, even if Mrs. Langston's eyes bored into him with judgment. The first few students went up, presenting on figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Mrs. Langston's critiques were mostly mild, praising their efforts and offering only minor suggestions for improvement. Malik noticed how she smiled and nodded at his classmates, encouraging them with gentle words. Then it was Malik's turn. He stood, clutching his carefully prepared notes, and walked to the front of the room. He cleared his throat, glancing nervously at the sea of faces staring back at him. Mrs. Langston's eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable. "Today I'm going to talk about Rosa Parks," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She was a woman of quiet strength, who chose to stand up by sitting down. When she refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in 1955, she sparked a movement that led to a series of protests and changes in the law. But it wasn't just about that one act. Rosa Parks' life was dedicated to fighting for equality and justice long before that bus ride. As he continued, Malik found his confidence growing. He spoke about the broader impact of Rosa Parks' actions, how her defiance became a symbol of resistance, a spark that ignited the Montgomery bus boycott. He shared stories he had read about her life, the sacrifices she made, and the threats she faced. Malik's voice grew stronger, filled with the admiration and respect he felt for a woman who had risked everything to stand up for what was right. But as he spoke, he noticed Mrs. Langston's expression hardening. Her arms were crossed, her eyes narrowed, and her lips pursed into a thin line. When he finished, she gave a small, dismissive clap, the sound barely audible in the otherwise silent room. "Thank you, Malik," she said in a clipped tone. "While you've covered the basic facts, I find that your presentation lacked the depth we expect at this level. It felt shallow. Perhaps if you had spent more time analyzing the social implications of her actions, rather than merely recounting events, your presentation would have been more compelling." The words hit Malik like a slap. He had worked so hard, poured everything he had into this presentation, and she had dismissed it with barely a nod. He felt his hands clench, the frustration rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "But I did discuss the impact," Malik said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I talked about how her actions led to the bus boycott and how that inspired other movements. I thought that was important." Mrs. Langston's eyes narrowed further, a glint of impatience flashing across her face. "As I said, Malik, it's about depth. Simply listing historical events is not enough. It's clear you're struggling to grasp the nuances of the material. If you'd like, you can stay after school for extra help." The implication was clear, and Malik could feel the embarrassment burning in his cheeks. She was telling him, in front of the entire class, that he wasn't good enough, that his work didn't measure up. He looked around, seeing some of his classmates exchange glances, a few of them smirking. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Malik nodded, muttering a quiet, "Okay," before retreating back to his seat. He kept his head down, fighting the urge to storm out of the room. His heart pounded, a mixture of anger and shame swirling within him. He had worked harder on this presentation than he had on any other assignment this semester, yet it still wasn't enough for her. As he sat down, he overheard a few whispers from the students sitting nearby. One of them, a boy named Liam, who was known for barely putting effort into his assignments, leaned over to his friend and chuckled. "Guess some people just aren't cut out for this stuff," he muttered under his breath. Malik's fists clenched tighter, but he forced himself to stay silent. He couldn't let them see how much it hurt. Instead, he focused on breathing, on keeping his expression neutral, even as Mrs. Langston moved on to the next student without a second thought. The rest of the class passed in a haze. Malik barely registered the other presentations or Mrs. Langston's comments. His mind was filled with her words, the sting of her dismissal, the frustration of knowing that no matter how hard he tried, she would always find a reason to put him down. When the bell finally rang, he gathered his things and hurried out of the classroom, his head down. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to see the pity or amusement in his classmates' eyes. He just wanted to be alone. Outside, Malik found a quiet spot near the bike racks, away from the bustling students. He leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the presentation, every word Mrs. Langston had said. He couldn't understand why she treated him this way, why she seemed determined to undermine him at every turn. A few minutes later, Caleb found him, his face filled with concern. "Hey man, I heard what happened in class. You okay?" Malik managed a small nod, though he didn't feel okay at all. "Yeah, I mean, I tried my best, you know. But she just dismissed it, like it didn't matter." Caleb shook his head, his expression hardening. "She's got a problem, Malik. Anyone with half a brain could see you worked hard on that presentation. She's just, I don't know. Maybe she doesn't like that you're trying to prove her wrong." Malik sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't get it. I thought teachers were supposed to help you, not tear you down. But with her, it feels like she's just waiting for me to mess up." Caleb was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. Then he placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Listen, man, you don't have to take this. You should talk to someone. Maybe the principal. Tell him what's going on. Mrs. Langston can't just keep treating you like this." Malik hesitated, his heart pounding. The thought of going to the principal, of reporting Mrs. Langston, filled him with both hope and dread. What if he wasn't believed? What if the principal dismissed him the same way Mrs. Langston had? "I don't know, Caleb," he said quietly. "What if it just makes things worse? What if no one believes me?" Caleb's grip on his shoulder tightened, his expression fierce. "Then I'll go with you. I'll tell them what I've seen. You're not alone in this, Malik." Malik looked at his friend, a glimmer of gratitude warming the cold knot in his chest. Knowing that Caleb had his back, that someone else saw what he was going through, gave him a flicker of hope. "Thanks, man," Malik said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Caleb grinned, giving him a playful shove. "You'd probably just keep letting her walk all over you. But don't worry. We're going to figure this out." The two friends spent the rest of the afternoon talking, strategizing, trying to come up with a plan. By the time they parted ways, Malik felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't sure how he would confront Mrs. Langston, but he knew he couldn't keep staying silent. That evening, As Malik sat at the kitchen table working on his homework, his mom noticed the change in his demeanor. LaToya had always been perceptive, and she could tell when something was weighing on her son. "Malik," she said, setting down her coffee mug and taking a seat across from him, "is everything okay? You seem different tonight." Malik hesitated, his mind racing. He had wanted to keep this from her, not wanting to add to her worries. But as he looked into her concerned eyes, he realized he couldn't hide the truth forever. Taking a deep breath, he began to tell her everything. The low grades, the dismissive comments, the way Mrs. Langston seemed to single him out. LaToya listened intently, her face growing more serious with each word. When he finished, she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Malik," she said softly, her voice filled with love and strength, "no one has the right to make you feel like you're less than anyone else. You are smart, capable, and deserving of respect. And if Mrs. Langston can't see that, then it's her problem, not yours." Malik felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over him. "But what can I do, Mom? She's the teacher. She's the one with the power." LaToya's eyes hardened, a glint of determination shining in them. "We're going to do something about this. Tomorrow, we're going to talk to the principal. And I'm going with you." Malik nodded, a newfound courage filling him. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight, that he had people who believed in him, who would stand by him no matter what. With his mom and Caleb by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. As he went to bed that night, Malik's mind raced with anticipation and a hint of fear. Tomorrow, he would stand up for himself. Tomorrow, he would confront the injustice he had been enduring in silence. Tomorrow, everything would change. The meeting. The following morning, Malik woke up with a strange combination of nerves and determination. He had spent most of the night tossing and turning, replaying Mrs. Langston's words and expressions over and over in his mind. Her disdain, the cold dismissiveness, the unspoken judgment, it was all seared into his memory. Today, however, he wouldn't have to face her alone. His mom, LaToya, had promised to come with him to the principal's office, and just knowing she would be there gave him a boost of confidence. At breakfast, LaToya sat across from him, sipping her coffee with a calm intensity that reassured him. She was a small woman, but she possessed a strength that made her presence commanding. Malik had seen that strength countless times when she stood up for him and his siblings, whether it was a small issue at home or a more serious matter at school. She believed in justice and fairness, and Malik knew she wouldn't rest until he received both. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" she asked, reaching across the table to give his hand a reassuring squeeze. He nodded, though his stomach churned. "Yeah, I'm ready. I don't know how this is going to go." LaToya gave him a soft smile. "You're doing the right thing, Malik. Standing up for yourself is never easy, especially when someone in authority is in the wrong. But remember, you're not alone in this. You have me, and you have the truth on your side." Her words settled his nerves, if only a little. After they finished breakfast, they headed to the school, arriving just as the morning bell rang. Malik's heart raced as they walked through the crowded hallways, his classmates glancing curiously at him, wondering why he was walking with his mother so early in the day. They'd reached the principal's office, and LaToya knocked firmly on the door. A moment later, Principal Saunders opened it, looking slightly surprised to see them. "Mrs. Andrews, Malik," he greeted, adjusting his glasses. "Please, come in." Principal Saunders was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and a gentle demeanor. He had a reputation for being fair, and Malik had always respected him. Still, standing in front of him now, Malik couldn't help feeling small. He glanced at his mom, who gave him a reassuring nod as they took their seats. "So, what brings you both here this morning?" Principal Saunders asked, folding his hands on his desk and looking at them attentively. LaToya took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you for seeing us, Principal Saunders. We're here because Malik has been having some difficulties in his history class with Mrs. Langston. He feels, no, we both feel, that he's being treated unfairly, and it's affecting his confidence and his grades. Principal Saunders raised an eyebrow, his expression turning serious. Unfairly? Can you explain what's been happening, Malik? Malik shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the principal's gaze on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and began recounting his experiences with Mrs. Langston. He explained how she often gave him lower grades despite his hard work, how her critiques seemed harsher and more personal than with other students, and how she had humiliated him in front of the class during his presentation on Rosa Parks. As he spoke, Malik noticed Principal Saunders' expression change, his eyes narrowing, his mouth tightening. The principal listened intently, not interrupting once. When Malik finished, he looked down, feeling a strange mixture of relief and vulnerability. Saying it all out loud had made it real, had exposed his pain in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. After a pause, Principal Saunders turned to LaToya. "Mrs. Andrews, have you noticed any changes in Malik's behavior at home because of this?" LaToya nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes. Malik used to love history, used to be excited about learning. But lately, he's been quiet, withdrawn, especially after working so hard on his assignments only to get disappointing feedback from Mrs. Langston. I know my son, Principal Saunders. He's a diligent student. I can see the effort he's putting in, and I can see the toll this situation is taking on him." The principal leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Malik, I understand that Mrs. Langston is a strict teacher. She holds all her students to a high standard, and sometimes her feedback can be direct. But are you suggesting that her behavior toward you is different than with your classmates?" Malik swallowed, his throat dry. "Yes, sir. It feels like she's always expecting me to fail, like she's just waiting for me to mess up so she can point it out. She praises other students, even when they don't put in much effort. But with me, it's like nothing I do is ever good enough." Principal Saunders nodded slowly, glancing between Malik and his mother. "I'll admit, I'm surprised to hear this. Mrs. Langston has been with us for many years, and she's generally well regarded by both students and parents. However, I take any accusations of unfair treatment very seriously." LaToya leaned forward, her voice firm. "This isn't just about grades, Principal Saunders. It's about the message that Mrs. Langston is sending to my son, that he's somehow less capable, that he doesn't belong, that he isn't worthy of the same respect as his peers. That kind of treatment can do lasting damage to a child's confidence. It's unacceptable." Principal Saunders met her gaze, his expression solemn. "I understand, Mrs. Andrews, and I assure you, I will investigate this matter thoroughly. I'll start by reviewing Malik's recent assignments and speaking with Mrs. Langston directly. If necessary, I'll also observe a few of her classes to get a better understanding of her teaching methods." Malik felt a glimmer of hope, though he still couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his stomach. The thought of Principal Saunders speaking to Mrs. Langston, of her finding out he had reported her, was both empowering and terrifying. He had no idea how she would react, but he knew he couldn't let her behavior continue unchecked. "Thank you, Principal Saunders," LaToya said, her tone appreciative but still firm. "We trust you to handle this matter fairly. Malik deserves to feel safe and respected in his classroom, and right now, he doesn't." Principal Saunders nodded, offering them a reassuring smile. "I appreciate you both bringing this to my attention. I'll do everything I can to ensure Malik receives the respect he deserves." They shook hands, and as Malik and his mother left the office, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that he had taken a step forward, that he had chosen to stand up for himself, but he also knew that this was far from over. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Malik's classmates noticed the tension in him, the way he seemed lost in thought, but he shrugged off their questions with a polite smile. He didn't want to share what had happened, didn't want to risk spreading rumors until he knew what Principal Saunders would do. By the time history class rolled around, Malik's nerves were on edge. He walked into the classroom, his heart pounding as he saw Mrs. Langston at her desk, flipping through a stack of papers. She glanced up briefly, her gaze lingering on him with an expression he couldn't quite read, an unsettling mixture of suspicion and disdain. He took his usual seat at the back, forcing himself to keep his head up, to meet her gaze with quiet resilience. He knew that she didn't know about his meeting with Principal Saunders yet, but he could feel the tension building, as if both of them were anticipating an inevitable clash. Class began, and Mrs. Langston launched into a lecture on the Reconstruction era. Malik tried to focus on her words, taking notes as best he could, but his mind kept drifting to the meeting. He wondered what Mrs. Langston would say if she found out, wondered if she would retaliate in some subtle way that he wouldn't be able to prove. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the power she held over his grades, his reputation, his future. Halfway through the lesson, Mrs. Langston paused, her gaze scanning the room. "Malik," she said, her tone deceptively pleasant, "I noticed that your last assignment lacked some of the key analysis points we discussed in class. Perhaps you could stay after school for some additional guidance." The words were carefully chosen, but Malik could hear the underlying insult, the implication that he was incapable of understanding the material on his own. He felt the eyes of his classmates on him, some curious, others amused, and he fought the urge to sink lower in his seat. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak up. "Actually, I spent a lot of time on that assignment, Mrs. Langston. I thought I covered the analysis points pretty thoroughly." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Effort is commendable, Malik, but results are what matter. If you are struggling, there's no shame in asking for help." The humiliation was sharp, stinging. Malik clenched his fists under the desk, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, but he refused to let her see him falter. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Langston," he replied, his voice steady, "but I think I understand the material just fine." She pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing slightly, and for a moment, he thought she might argue. But then she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Very well," she said curtly, turning back to the blackboard. As the class continued, Malik sat in silence, his mind racing. He knew that he had made a bold choice by standing up to her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made himself an even bigger target. Mrs. Langston wasn't the kind of person to let a challenge go unanswered, and he had no idea how far she would go to put him back in his place. But as he glanced around the room, he saw Caleb giving him a subtle nod of encouragement, and he felt a surge of determination. He wasn't alone in this fight, and he wasn't going to back down. After class, as he packed up his things, Mrs. Langston shot him one last cold look before sweeping out of the room. Malik let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension slowly drain from his body. He had survived another day, another small battle in a larger war. And as he left the classroom, he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. He had the truth on his side, and for the first time, he felt strong enough to wield it. Confronting the system. The following morning, Malik arrived at school with a feeling of anticipation and a quiet dread. After the tense exchange in class the previous day, he knew things were coming to a head. He hadn't heard back from Principal Saunders yet, but he trusted that the principal was working on it. However, the idea of Mrs. Langston being confronted about her behavior filled him with both hope and fear. How would she react? Would she finally change, or would she find new ways to make his life miserable? As he walked through the hallway, Malik felt the weight of the situation settling on him. He could feel the stares of his classmates, some curious, others indifferent. He wondered if anyone else noticed how Mrs. Langston treated him. Did they see the subtle, almost invisible ways she belittled him? Or was he the only one feeling the sting of her unfair treatment? When he reached his history class, Malik paused outside the door, taking a deep breath. He didn't know what to expect today, but he was determined to walk in with his head held high. Whatever happened, he would face it with resilience. As he entered the classroom, he was surprised to see Principal Saunders standing at the front, talking quietly with Mrs. Langston. The sight sent a shock through him, and he felt his stomach twist with nerves. This was it. The principal was here to address the complaints he and his mother had made. His heart pounded as he took his seat, trying to appear calm even as anxiety roared within him. Mrs. Langston's face was a mask of composure, but Malik could see a glint of tension in her eyes. She glanced at him briefly, a flicker of irritation crossing her face, before she turned back to Principal Saunders. "Good morning, class," Principal Saunders said, addressing the room. His voice was calm but firm. "I wanted to sit in on today's lesson to observe. I believe it's always beneficial for administrators to be familiar with the classroom environment, and I look forward to seeing the hard work you all put into your studies." A murmur of excitement spread through the class. It wasn't every day that the principal sat in on a lesson. Malik noticed that some of his classmates shot him questioning looks, but he kept his focus straight ahead, unwilling to give anything away. Mrs. Langston straightened, her voice cool and professional, as she began the lesson on the Reconstruction era. She explained the historical context, discussing the challenges faced by newly freed African Americans and the efforts to rebuild the South after the Civil War. Her words were as precise and authoritative as ever, but Malik could sense an underlying tension, a stiffness in her manner that wasn't usually there. As she lectured, she made a point of calling on various students, asking questions about the material. Malik watched her closely, noticing how she avoided looking at him, how she seemed to gloss over his part of the room. It was as if his presence was an irritant, something she didn't want to acknowledge in front of the principal. But then, midway through the lesson, Mrs. Langston turned her gaze toward him, her eyes cold and calculating. "Malik," she said, her tone almost too polite, "perhaps you can explain the significance of the Black Codes and their impact on the freedoms of African Americans during Reconstruction." The question was laced with challenge, and Malik knew she was testing him, trying to make him stumble. He felt his heart rate spike, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had studied the material thoroughly, had spent hours researching and reading, because he wanted to be prepared, not just for the lesson, but for any scrutiny she threw his way. The Black Codes were laws passed by Southern states after the Civil War to restrict the freedoms of African Americans, Malik replied, his voice steady. They were designed to maintain control over black people and keep them in a position of servitude, even after slavery was abolished. These laws made it difficult for African Americans to own property, travel freely, and find jobs. They were essentially a way to keep them oppressed and limit their rights as citizens. Mrs. Langston's mouth tightened, and for a moment, Malik thought she might argue with him. But then she nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "A satisfactory answer," she said, her voice flat. "However, you could have included more detail about the specific restrictions imposed by these laws." Malik bit back a retort, knowing that any attempt to defend himself would only make things worse. She would always find something lacking, always point out what he hadn't said rather than acknowledging what he had. It was a game she played, and he was tired of being her pawn. Principal Saunders, however, seemed to notice the subtle shift in her tone. He watched her closely, his gaze sharp and discerning. After a moment, he spoke up. "I think Malik gave a very thorough answer," Principal Saunders said, his tone polite but firm. His explanation captured the essence of the Black Codes and their purpose during Reconstruction. It's important to recognize students' efforts to understand and convey complex material. Mrs. Langston's face remained impassive, but Malik could see the flicker of irritation in her eyes. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of her students. It was clear that the principal's presence was disrupting her usual rhythm, and Malik felt a small surge of satisfaction. For the first time, someone was standing up for him, calling out her subtle attempts to undermine him. The rest of the lesson proceeded with similar tension. Mrs. Langston continued to lecture, but her demeanor remained tense, her tone clipped. Malik felt as if he were under a microscope, with every word he spoke being weighed and measured. But with Principal Saunders there, he found a newfound strength. He answered her questions confidently, refusing to let her intimidate him. Finally, the lesson ended, and the bell rang. As the students began to gather their things, Principal Saunders approached Mrs. Langston, speaking quietly to her. Malik couldn't hear their conversation, but he could tell from her body language that she was uncomfortable, her posture rigid and defensive. Malik collected his things, glancing over at Caleb, who gave him a supportive nod. They didn't need to exchange words. The look was enough to convey that Caleb understood the significance of what had just happened. This was a small victory, but it was one that Malik felt deeply. As he walked out of the classroom, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Principal Saunders, who gestured for him to follow. Malik's heart pounded as they walked together down the hallway and into the principal's office. Inside, Principal Saunders closed the door and gestured for Malik to sit. "Malik, I wanted to speak to you privately about what I observed today," he began, his expression serious but kind. "It's clear to me that there's a disconnect between your work and the feedback you've been receiving from Mrs. Langston. I could see the effort you put into your responses, and I want you to know that I recognize the quality of your answers." Malik felt a wave of relief, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Thank you, Principal Saunders. It's been difficult. I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough for her." Principal Saunders nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that, and I believe your concerns are valid. I'm committed to ensuring that every student here is treated with respect and fairness. I'll be having a more in-depth conversation with Mrs. Langston about her approach and her expectations. I want to make sure that you and every other student are given the same opportunities to succeed." Malik felt a flicker of hope. "I really appreciate that, sir. I just want to be treated like everyone else." Principal Saunders smiled, a reassuring warmth in his gaze. "And you deserve that, Malik. You're a bright young man with a lot of potential, and I don't want anything to hinder that. If you continue to experience any issues, please don't hesitate to come to me. This school is a place for learning and growth, not for judgment or bias." As he stood up, Malik felt a sense of validation he hadn't experienced in weeks. For so long, he had felt invisible, his struggles unnoticed or dismissed. But now, with Principal Saunders' support, he knew he wasn't alone. He had taken a step toward change, and for the first time, he felt like his voice truly mattered. When he left the principal's office, Malik spotted his mother waiting outside. Her eyes were filled with anticipation, her hands clasped tightly. "How did it go, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Malik smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It went well, Mom. Principal Saunders is going to talk to Mrs. Langston and make sure I'm treated fairly." Latoya exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as she pulled him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Malik. You stood up for yourself, and you showed so much courage." As they walked out of the school together, Malik felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, or how Mrs. Langston would react after her conversation with the principal. But he knew that he had taken control of his own story, had refused to let her define him. This was more than just a victory over one teacher's bias. It was a lesson in resilience, in self-respect, in the power of standing up for what was right. And as he walked out into the bright afternoon sun, Malik knew he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time, he felt truly free. The consequences. The following week, Malik returned to school with a sense of cautious optimism. Principal Saunders had assured him that steps were being taken to address his concerns with Mrs. Langston. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd be able to complete the semester without the constant stress and frustration he'd been enduring. But as he walked into Mrs. Langston's history class that Monday, he quickly sensed that things were not as calm as he had hoped. The usual hum of students settling into their seats seemed sharper, as if everyone was on edge. Malik noticed several of his classmates glancing at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Langston stood at the front of the classroom, her posture stiff, her face set in an expression that could have cut glass. She didn't make eye contact with Malik, nor did she look at any of the students directly. Instead, she focused on a stack of papers in front of her, flipping through them with brisk, almost aggressive motions. Malik couldn't help but wonder what Principal Saunders had said to her after his observation last week. He had hoped for a change, but seeing her icy demeanor, he began to feel a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "All right, class," Mrs. Langston began, her voice colder than usual. "Today we will be reviewing your essays on the Reconstruction era. I expect each of you to be prepared to defend your arguments and answer any questions I may have." She began handing out the essays, her movements quick and controlled. As she reached Malik's row, her gaze lingered on him for the briefest of moments, a flash of something unreadable in her eyes before she looked away. When she finally handed him his paper, she did so with a slight sneer, her lips curving in a way that made Malik's skin crawl. He glanced down at his essay, bracing himself for the inevitable criticism. To his shock, he saw a large D scrawled across the top in red ink, accompanied by comments that seemed more cutting than constructive. "Lacks critical insight," she had written in the margins. "Argument is weak and poorly supported." Malik felt his hands tremble slightly as he read her comments. He knew he had put in the work, had spent hours researching, drafting, and revising his arguments. He couldn't understand how she could see his effort as anything less than thorough. This wasn't about feedback. It felt like punishment. He raised his hand, his heart pounding. Mrs. Langston's eyes flicked toward him, and for a moment, he thought she might ignore him. But then she gave a curt nod, her expression impatient. "Yes, Malik. I don't understand the grade," he said, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "I thought I followed the guidelines and provided a strong argument. Could you explain where I went wrong?" Mrs. Langston's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing. She looked at him with a disdainful expression that made Malik feel as though he were being judged not just for his work, but for daring to question her authority. "Well, Malik," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "perhaps if you had spent more time analyzing the material rather than simply summarizing it, you might have done better. I'm afraid effort alone does not equal excellence." The word stung, sharper than he had expected. It wasn't just the grade. It was the way she dismissed him, as if his efforts, his intellect, were inherently lacking. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some of them sympathetic, others confused. He fought the urge to shrink back, to hide from their scrutiny, but he couldn't ignore the growing frustration simmering within him. "But I did analyze it," he insisted, his voice wavering. "I looked at the impact of the Reconstruction policies and how they affected African Americans. I thought I did what was asked." Mrs. Langston's eyes flashed, and she folded her arms, her posture defensive. "You thought," she repeated with a sneer. "Thinking and understanding are two very different things, Malik. Perhaps if you focus more on listening to instruction, rather than assuming you know better, you'd find yourself more successful in this class." The room was silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Malik felt his face burn, humiliation mixing with anger. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but he knew that any further resistance would only give her more ammunition to belittle them. So he clenched his jaw and nodded, forcing himself to sit back down, his mind a whirlwind of frustration and resentment. As he looked down at his paper, he could feel the weight of Mrs. Langston's words pressing on him, trying to diminish his sense of self-worth. But something inside him resisted, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. He wouldn't let her see him broken. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. After class, Malik waited until the room had emptied before gathering his things. He moved slowly, hoping to avoid another encounter with Mrs. Langston, but as he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Malik," she called, her tone unreadable. He turned, his jaw tight, refusing to show the vulnerability he felt. Mrs. Langston studied him for a moment, her expression a mixture of irritation and something else. Something darker, almost vindictive. "I'm aware," she said quietly, her voice dripping with disdain, "that you've taken it upon yourself to involve the principal in your academic struggles. While I am required to follow protocol and entertain these complaints, I hope you understand that it will not change the standards of this classroom. If anything, I expect even more from you now. I will not tolerate mediocrity disguised as effort." Malik's stomach churned, his mind reeling from the implied threat. She was letting him know, in no uncertain terms, that her scrutiny would only intensify. He realized with growing dread that by speaking up, he had not only failed to improve his situation, but had potentially made it worse. Without another word, he turned and left the classroom, the weight of her warning pressing on him like a physical burden. As he walked down the hall, he tried to collect his thoughts, to find some way to make sense of the situation. He had done everything right. He had worked hard, spoken up, and sought support from the principal. And yet, here he was, feeling more defeated than ever. He found Caleb waiting for him near the lockers, his friend's face full of concern. "Hey man, what happened? You look like you just got run over." Malik sighed, slumping against the lockers. "It's Mrs. Langston. She's still at it. I thought Principal Saunders would help, but now it feels like she's just out to make things even harder for me." Caleb frowned, his eyes flashing with anger. "That's messed up, Malik. She's a teacher. She's supposed to help you, not tear you down." Malik nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I don't know what to do, Caleb. I thought standing up for myself would make a difference, but it's only made her more determined to see me fail." Caleb placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, his expression fierce. "Then we need to take this higher. This isn't just a one-time thing. It's harassment. She's abusing her power, and that's not okay." Malik felt a surge of gratitude for his friend's support, but he hesitated. "But what if it just makes things worse? I'm already struggling in her class. If I push this too far, she might find a way to fail me completely." Caleb shook his head. "Then let's make it so she can't. We need to document everything, every grade, every comment, every unfair thing she says. If we can show a pattern, Principal Saunders won't be able to ignore it. And if he does, we go to the school board." Malik considered Caleb's words, the idea filling him with a mixture of hope and fear. It was a bold plan, one that required courage and resilience. But he knew that he couldn't keep letting Mrs. Langston tear him down, couldn't keep pretending that her words didn't hurt. "All right," he said finally, nodding. "I'll do it. I'll start keeping track." Caleb smiled, giving him a supportive pat on the back. "You've got this, man. And you're not alone. We'll take her down together." That night, Malik sat at his desk, pulling out his assignments from Mrs. Langston's class. He carefully read through each grade, each comment, each piece of feedback, documenting it all in a notebook. As he worked, he felt a strange sense of empowerment, as if he were reclaiming a part of himself that Mrs. Langston had tried to strip away. He wrote down her dismissive remarks, her thinly veiled insults, her condescending tone. He recalled specific moments when she had belittled him in front of the class, times when she had gone out of her way to ignore his efforts. With each word he wrote, he felt the weight of her cruelty lessening, replaced by a growing determination to see this through. In the days that followed, Malik continued to document his interactions with Mrs. Langston. He kept a record of every grade, every comment, every interaction that made him feel small or inadequate. He shared his notes with Caleb, who encouraged him to keep going, to keep gathering evidence. Eventually, Malik planned to meet with Principal Saunders again, this time with a solid case, a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed. He knew that this fight would be long and difficult, but he also knew that it was necessary. And as he sat in Mrs. Langston's class, feeling the weight of her cold gaze on him, he held his head high, refusing to let her break him. Because he was more than her assumptions, more than her judgment, more than the box she tried to put him in. Malik Andrews was resilient, determined, and worthy of respect. And he would keep fighting for that respect, no matter how long it took. Triumph and transformation. In the days that followed, Malik's resolve hardened. Each morning, he would arrive at school with his notebook tucked into his backpack, ready to document every interaction with Mrs. Langston. He had been keeping a meticulous record, and each entry filled him with a sense of empowerment. This was his truth, undeniable and documented, a testament to his efforts and Mrs. Langston's constant undermining. With every condescending remark she threw his way, he felt more determined, knowing that he was building a case she couldn't easily brush aside. By now, Caleb and a few other friends were well aware of what Malik was going through, and they supported him in small but meaningful ways. Caleb would sit closer to him in class, giving him nods of encouragement whenever Mrs. Langston tried to belittle him. Some of his other classmates, noticing the unfair treatment, had even started whispering to each other about it, sharing stories of moments they'd observed when Mrs. Langston had treated Malik differently. Slowly, Malik realized he wasn't as alone in this fight as he had thought. A week later, armed with pages of documented evidence, Malik and his mother returned to Principal Saunders' office. Latoya had read through Malik's notes the night before, her face growing increasingly serious as she turned each page. Malik could see the determination in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness she felt as she realized just how much he had endured. She had hugged him tightly that night, whispering, "You're so brave, Malik. You did the right thing. And now, it's time we make sure this ends." As they sat across from Principal Saunders, Latoya placed the notebook on his desk, her voice calm but firm. "Principal Saunders, I believe we discussed Malik's experiences with Mrs. Langston previously, and you promised to investigate. My son has been keeping a record of his interactions with her since then, and I think you'll find that the evidence speaks for itself." Principal Saunders' face grew serious as he picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. Malik watched him, his heart pounding as he saw the principal's expression shift from curiosity to concern, then finally to anger. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the rustling of paper as Principal Saunders reviewed entry after entry. After a long pause, he looked up at Malik, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and respect. "Malik, I'm deeply sorry that you've had to endure this. No student should ever feel belittled or disrespected in their own classroom, especially by a teacher. This is unacceptable." Latoya nodded, her voice steady. "My son deserves to be treated with the same respect as any other student. We trusted Mrs. Langston to nurture his love for learning, but instead, she's crushed his confidence and made him feel as though he doesn't belong." Principal Saunders sighed, rubbing his temples as he absorbed the weight of their words. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Andrews. I want to assure you both that this behavior is not tolerated in our school. Malik, I commend you for your bravery in documenting these incidents. This is very compelling evidence, and I'll be escalating this matter to the school board. There will be consequences." Malik felt a wave of relief wash over him. For so long, he had carried the weight of Mrs. Langston's harshness alone, fearing that no one would believe him. But now, with his mother and Principal Saunders on his side, he felt a profound sense of validation. His voice had been heard. "I also want to apologize personally, Malik," Principal Saunders continued, his tone sincere. "I should have done more when you first came to me. I didn't realize the extent of what you were going through, and for that, I'm sorry. You deserved better support from the very beginning." Malik nodded, appreciating the apology. "Thank you, Principal Saunders. I want to learn without feeling like I'm constantly being judged, like I'm less than everyone else. That's all I wanted." Principal Saunders gave him a reassuring smile. And that's exactly what you'll have, Malik. I'll make sure of it." The next day, a substitute teacher greeted Malik's class instead of Mrs. Langston. Word spread quickly that Mrs. Langston had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation by the school board. The students buzzed with curiosity, but Malik remained quiet, his mind reeling with the impact of what had just happened. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Over the next few days, his classmates began to approach him, some with apologies, others with words of support. Even students who hadn't been close to him before seemed to recognize the courage it had taken to stand up to a teacher who had treated him unfairly. One afternoon, Liam, one of the students Mrs. Langston had favored, walked up to Malik at lunch. He looked uncomfortable, rubbing the back of his neck as he spoke. "Hey, Malik, I just wanted to say that I didn't realize how tough things were for you in her class. I thought she was just strict, but, well, I heard about everything. And I'm sorry, man. I should have spoken up when I saw how she treated you." Malik gave him a small, understanding smile. "Thanks, Liam. It's okay. It's hard to see things when you're not the one going through them." Liam nodded, relief in his eyes. "Yeah, but still, if you ever need anything, let me know." The support from his classmates gave Malik a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. For weeks, he had felt isolated, convinced that no one else saw the injustice he was facing. But now, he realized that people were paying attention, that his courage had not only changed his own life, but had inspired others to be more aware, more compassionate. A few weeks later, Principal Saunders asked Malik to come to his office. When Malik arrived, he was surprised to find Mrs. Langston there, looking noticeably different. She was no longer the stern, unyielding figure he had known. Her face was softer, almost remorseful. Principal Saunders gave Malik an encouraging nod. "Malik," Mrs. Langston began, her voice unusually quiet, "I wanted to speak with you personally. After reflecting on my behavior and hearing from Principal Saunders and the school board, I've come to realize that I was wrong in the way I treated you. My actions were unfair, and I let my biases cloud my judgment. I am truly sorry." Malik felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, resentment, and a lingering hurt. He didn't want to simply forgive her and pretend everything was fine. But he also recognized the courage it took for her to acknowledge her wrongdoing. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Langston," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "It hurt, a lot. I felt like I was being punished no matter how hard I tried, and it made me question myself. I hope no one else has to go through that." Mrs. Langston nodded, looking down at her hands. "I understand, Malik. I've realized that as a teacher, my job is not just to teach facts, but to inspire and uplift. I failed you, and I'm deeply sorry for that. I'm committed to changing, to becoming a better educator. I hope, one day, you can forgive me." Malik took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle. He wasn't sure he was ready to forgive, but he could feel a part of himself beginning to heal, beginning to move past the hurt she had caused. Principal Saunders spoke up, his tone warm. "Malik, I want to commend you again for your bravery. You stood up not only for yourself, but for every student who might have felt marginalized. You've made a difference in this school, and we're grateful for that." Malik left the office that day feeling a profound sense of closure. Mrs. Langston's apology didn't erase the pain, but it allowed him to see her as human, flawed, capable of growth, and willing to change. In a way, it was a reminder of the power of empathy, of the need to hold people accountable while also giving them a chance to improve. As the semester drew to a close, Malik's love for learning returned, unburdened by the fear of judgment. With the support of his friends, family, and Principal Saunders, he had reclaimed his confidence, his sense of self-worth, and his passion for history. He no longer walked through the hallways with a sense of dread, but with pride, knowing that he had fought for his place and won. On the last day of school, Caleb found him by his locker, grinning. "Hey, man, you did it. You're basically a legend around here now." Malik chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know about that. But yeah, it feels good. I feel like I can finally be myself. As they walked out of the school together, Malik felt the warmth of the sun on his face, a fitting end to a difficult journey. He knew that life would continue to throw challenges his way, but now he was ready to face them head-on, with resilience, dignity, and the knowledge that his voice mattered. And as he looked back at the school, a sense of peace settled over him. He had transformed his struggle into strength, his pain into purpose. Malik had fought for his right to be seen, heard, and respected, and he had emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for every student who came after him.